Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I am Nurse Babe Britt, and in today's video I'm going to talk about what my orientation experience was like for me when I was a new grad in the CVICU. So if that is something that's been on your mind or interests you, then please stay tuned and listen for more. So lately I have gotten several questions about what orientation was like for me when I was a new grad, and also any helpful advice or tips that I have for other people starting out in the CVICU as a new grad or new to the CVICU environment. And so I wanted to make this video covering all of that. So when I started out as a new grad, I applied and worked for a teaching hospital, and it was a residency program. So it was a new grad RN residency program, and it was supposed to be 6 months long, but it ended up being 5 months long because COVID and all this other stuff started going on, and so they cut it short because they really needed us off orientation because they really needed nurses. So the first 4 months was day shift, and then my last month I was on night shift. And so if it was 6 months long, then it would have been 4 months on day shift, 2 months on night shift, but it wasn't that, so it got cut short a little bit. And at that time, all new grads had to start on night shift, and so that is how it was set up. I know now it could be a little different depending on where you go, but that's how it was to transition us into night shift. And then once I got off orientation, I was already on nights, and so I just started working my own schedule and not what my preceptor was working. I pretty much had the same preceptors on days, and then I had the same preceptors on nights, which I personally enjoyed because I feel like when you're constantly given a new preceptor each shift, then there's not a lot of continuity in the learning, and sometimes depending on the preceptor, they don't know what you know, and so you may feel like you are starting over every time you're put with a new person. So personally, I enjoyed having the same preceptors. I pretty much had the same two, but usually it was just really that one I was paired with on days, and then also the same thing when I was on nights. And they were really great nurses and had been nurses for a while, and so I was able to absorb all of their knowledge. And also, there were a lot of courses, a lot of classes I had to take when I was on orientation. It felt like nursing school all over again, I'm not going to lie to you, but it wasn't as intense as nursing school per se, because it wasn't the same type of pass or fail anxiety that you get when you're in nursing school. But I related to nursing school because of all the content that I had to learn, and it was in that moment that I realized nursing school can only teach you so much. You hear people say that, but then I actually was able to experience that. I didn't learn majority of all that stuff, really. I didn't learn in nursing school. Nursing school gives you the basics, the foundations, and then orientation and the residency program for me was able to build on top of that. And so some of the classes I had to take classes on all of the cardiac support devices as well as other critical care devices that you see. So that was LVAD, balloon pump, Impella, ECMO. I had to take a CRRT class, which is the dialysis treatment class. I had to take a hemodynamics class. I had to take a critical care class, and that critical care class, I'm getting tongue-tied, was mixed with everybody. So that was not CVICU specific, that was critical care specific. So that covered things like your drips and like insulin drips and protocols and all that stuff specific to the hospital. That was what that class covered. And then the educator for the unit that I worked on, well, she was actually a specialist, but anyway, she did her own classes for us on the unit that was more specific to the patients that we would see. So it was in addition to the critical care class. I also took a respiratory care class, and that class covered like all the different vent settings, all your different oxygen therapies, why you would use this vent setting over that vent setting, and what all of that means. So I had to take a class. That class was overwhelming. I felt like I was being made out to be a respiratory therapist after taking that class. It was taught by a respiratory therapist, so it was very detailed. But I will say after taking all of these classes, it's not like I left the class and I was just like, okay, I got it. No, it took seeing the patient, seeing some of these things and going on in motion for me to actually link the concepts with the patient and build on that and actually have a solid foundation and actually be able to remember all of the things that I learned. I also took a class based off of like PA catheters and central lines and how to use your PA catheter, how to do a cardiac output, how to use some of those different devices. And so there were a lot of classes. And then on top of that, I actually had to complete echo modules. So ECCO, echo. And echo is something that is used across the United States. It wasn't specific to the hospital that I worked at. And it's powered by the AACN, which is the American Association of Critical Care Nurses. And it is a online interactive computer program that is usually like if you are somewhere like, depending on what your hospital uses, you might see them load it into their HealthStream website or whatever educational website where you would do other regulatory modules. And it's an interactive experience, and it's basically everything critical care. So ECHO stands for, I wrote it down here, Essentials of Critical Care Orientation. So it serves as an adjunct to your orientation, but it's all online. And so for me, how it was set up is that usually I was working 2 12-hour shifts a week for a while. And then that third 12 hours was dedicated to doing my modules. And so after a while, I don't remember where in my orientation we actually started working 3 days a week, but at that point when we started working 3 days a week, they gave us enough time where it was like, okay, you should have wrapped up the echo modules or wrapping up the echo modules. And of course you get paid for that. You just write it, well, for me, we wrote it in a time lock, but you do get paid for those echo modules. And at that time, we were able to do it at home. I don't know about now. Like I said, COVID and all that stuff had happened. So I was able to do all of that at home. Even a lot of the classes were not in person, they were virtual. Now it may be a little different. But I do think the echo modules were very beneficial. So if that is something that you have to take at your hospital, don't take the information for granted, because a lot of it is very valid. It goes into detail about everything critical care, even pacemaker boxes and different settings, different things like that. It goes into really good detail and explains things. And so don't take that information for granted. Now, with that being said, like I said, there were a lot of classes, a lot of content I had to learn. I wasn't able to remember everything, after the end of the class. But what I would do is I would take notes on important things. And sometimes there were handouts that were given to us for some of the in-person classes, like printouts of like the PowerPoint that we went over. And I was able to make notes on that. And so in my spare time, when I had free time at work or maybe even at home, I would review some of that content so I could actually remember it and learn it, and it would make sense to me looking at it with a fresh set of eyes. And so on the floor, what orientation looked like for me was when I first started, of course, I was nervous. I had all the jitters. I was just like, oh my God. I was overwhelmed. I was excited. I was all the different emotions. So if you are feeling that or have felt that, just know that is normal. And I felt the same way too, and a lot of people in my cohort felt that way as well. I think what helps is having a good support system, whether it's some of the people that you're working with in your cohort that are starting with you so they know how you feel because they are currently feeling it, or even some of the other nurses on the unit. Maybe form a good bond with your preceptor, or maybe even family, friends. Just have a good support system, because like I said, it can be a bit much when you first start. But as with anything, my suggestion is to pace yourself. Take it a day at a time, and don't be too hard on yourself. Of course, challenge yourself, but don't be too hard on yourself, and enjoy your off days. And I say that because you don't want to spend all of your off days just strictly focused on nursing, education, all that stuff that you've learned during the week at work. Pick a little chunk of time on your off day to dedicate to that, and then the rest of the day, live your life. Do not let your job consume you in that way. And I think that's easy to happen when you first start, because you feel like, oh, okay, I gotta know it all, I gotta learn it all. You do have to learn it, but the expectation is not that when you get off orientation you're going to know everything, because that's not what it was for me. When I got off orientation, I didn't know everything. By the time I got to night shift, my last month of orientation, I felt like I had a very good concept of the foundations of CVICU patients and how to care for several different things. I had a good understanding of how to care for the devices. I had a good understanding of my medications. And so what I struggled with was time management, because when I was on day shift, I got a lot of one-to-one patients, and they were the really sick patients. And those are great patients to learn from. However, when you are constantly given one-to-one assignments, you don't get a chance to develop good time management skills when you have a day where you might come in and you have 2 patients, or please forbid 3 patients, but some hospitals do triple you. And so I struggled with time management, and that was something that my day shift preceptor was able to communicate to my night shift preceptors. And so that is an important thing too. If there's something you're struggling with or you're just not as confident in, communicate that to your preceptor, communicate that to your educator, your charge nurse, so that they can help you. Don't wait until the very end and speak up. Speak up when it's actually going on, so they can give you whatever resources, whatever help that you need, so that you can succeed. And you want to advocate for yourself so that you can have the best experience possible and absorb the most that you can. And so when I got to night shift, it had already been communicated that time management was just the main thing I needed to work on. And so when I was on night shift, we only had 2 patients. We never had 1 patient, and that unit luckily didn't really triple a lot, so that was like not a thought. But we only had 2 patient assignments, and I was grateful for that, because it helped me to learn how to manage taking care of multiple patients at one time, taking care of labs and giving medications, doing assessments, charting. And so I'm not stuck here until whenever time after the shift is ended, because I have to catch up on charting, because I got so behind during the shift that I couldn't chart. And so that helped me with that. And like I said, night shift is a slower pace than day shift. And so day shift, there's a lot more done on day shift as far as different interventions, trials, or whatever for your patients, versus night shift. That's not to say that night shift you don't do anything. That's not true. It's actually far from it. You have way more resources on day shift, which is why it's busier, and a lot more things are done on day shift versus nights. You don't have as many resources. You don't have as many doctors around, depending on your hospital. At the hospital I worked at, we didn't have doctors on night shift. They were there during the day, but not at night. So we just had our nurse practitioners or our physician's assistants and the nurses. And of course, you could page somebody if it was an emergency, but for the most part, you had to be able to keep your patient afloat for the whole night shift and not have as many resources. And so it's not that it's easier on nights, it's just a different pace, because you're not trying to decannulate somebody from ECMO on night shift, or, turning off all your sedation to see what they do. Like, you would on day shift when the surgeons or the doctors come in, like, oh, let's turn this off and see what happens. Like, you don't really do that as much on night shift. It can happen, but not as much. And so because of that, it frees up a little of your time to focus on things like time management and, just perfecting, I guess, your skills and getting better at your skills. And so that's what it was like for me. My advice, if you are a new grad starting in the CVICU, or even if you're a nurse and you have previous nursing experience, but not CVICU experience, is to ask questions, and don't ever feel like you have a dumb question. Don't ever feel like, oh, I'm not going to ask because the expectation is that I should know this. Even if that is the expectations, there's nothing wrong with asking, because they're going to forget, oh, that person asked the question. They really should have known, before they forget, okay, that person didn't ask me a question. They may have or may have not should have known that, but now the patient has been harmed. And so it's always good to ask questions if you are not sure of something, so that you don't bring any harm to your patients. And then also, you help yourself out as far as your education and just being a strong nurse. When you get off orientation, well, for me, let me say that. For me, when I got off orientation, I was not alone. I still had help. The unit I worked on had great teamwork. And so there was never a moment where I felt like I couldn't go to someone to ask a question, or I couldn't, rely on my coworker to help me with something. And I had developed good independence, yes, but I was still able to go to my charge nurse if I had certain questions, or maybe one of the senior nurses on the unit if I had certain questions. I wasn't just all alone. And I remember my first assignment when I got off orientation, they just gave me one patient. Wasn't a super sick patient, could have been paired easily, but they just gave me one patient, and they eased me into taking care of multiple patients and then taking care of those real sick patients by myself. And before you know it, time goes by, and things that you used to have to think twice about come second nature to you. And so you just have to give yourself time, pace yourself, and absorb all the knowledge you can. Ask all the questions that you have. And, that's pretty much it as far as advice. If you just graduated and let's say you already got your job offer, you signed, the offer, you agreed to take the job, but you haven't taken NCLEX yet. Focus on what's in front of you that's more pressing first. So focus on passing your NCLEX first before you start getting overwhelmed and all the other emotions when it comes to starting in a CVICU, ICU, wherever you're going to be working. Focus on what's important first, and then focus on the other things as well. If you are looking into, if you're coming from neuro ICU or maybe SICU or different ICUs, there are some classes that neuro nurses take that cardiac nurses don't take. And so the orientation looks a little different if you are a neuro ICU nurse or you're becoming a neuro ICU nurse. They use different devices in the neuro ICU that you may not always see in the cardiac ICU and vice versa. And so for new grads starting in a different specialty that's not cardiac, the same thing I mentioned about balloon pump and pellets, all that stuff that's cardiac specific, just replace that with whatever that is neuro specific or burns specific or whatever, and you're still going to have classes and courses that you have to take on that. At least that was my experience. And so overall, I feel like I had a good orientation. I had great, strong preceptors. They were patient with me, and they were perfect preceptors. I honestly have zero complaints, and I feel like the education was really good. Again, I did work at a teaching hospital, and since then I have traveled to several hospitals, and some of those hospitals have not been teaching hospitals. And I always ask, when I run into new grads or new nurses that are on the unit, what was the education like for them? How are they feeling? All those things. And when I compare the differing responses, I still 10 out of 10 recommend working at a teaching hospital first and then transitioning to those other hospitals. So I hope you guys found the information in my video helpful. If there's something that you feel like I didn't cover well, or something that you want me to dive deeper into, feel free to put all of that in the comment box below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn your notifications on so you can be the first to know when I post my next video. Again, I am Nurse Babe Britt. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.